In the reading corner today, I am joined by Frances Hardinge, who is both a winner of the Branford Boase Award quite a few years ago now for Fly By Night, and also a winner of the Costa Book of the Year Award as well. Well, Frances joins me today to talk about her latest novel, which is called Unraveller. And as you would expect, it's a thrilling story. It's a story that I think has its threads in history and folklore and fantasy, and also explores lots of ideas around crime and punishments. However, I'm not sure that that's how Frances would describe it. So as I welcome you into the reading corner, Frances, perhaps you can tell us how you would have set up your novel if you were talking about it.
I would probably describe Unraveller as a dark fairy tale adventure mystery that's set in an alternative world in an imaginary country called Radith. Now, at first glance, Radith looks like quite a sort of common sense sort of a place with all these Highland market towns and sensible laws. But if you look at the very edge of it, just along the coast, there's a narrow strip of wilds. And the wilds are these misty marshwoods. And they don't look like much from the outside. They just look like a greyish strip of woodland, maybe a few miles deep. But if you venture down into them, space twists, and you realise that actually they're vast. And this is quite a dark, unpredictable, quite fey, treacherous sort of a place where you might meet shapeshifters or man-eating horses or supernatural spiders, and anyone you meet could be anything.
I could actually feel the moss. I could see the brightness of the moss because you do evoke that world so beautifully. So it's interesting that you started by talking about setting for the story. Your prologue takes us there straight away and makes the setting really important. And I was really interested in how you'd written that, because unlike the narrative, you've written this as a second person account. It's kind of direct to the reader. And I felt almost like I was in gameplay mode. Was that deliberate?
I wasn't deliberately referencing role-playing games or anything of that sort, but I do play role-playing games. So it's always hard to say how much that influences the way I write. I mean, it certainly does. For example, world building. I am used to playing games where games masters have gone into a lot of depth in creating their worlds because they don't know which way the players are going to go. They need to make sure everything is detailed and thought out. So I guess I'm used to encountering that kind of really rich and thoughtful world building. I suspect the fact that I role play also affects the way I think about subsidiary characters. If one's a role player, then while one is focused on one's own character's arc, it's a collaborative storytelling exercise. Everybody else has their characters as well. And those characters all have their arcs. They have equally rich and detailed backgrounds. So I guess I'm used to thinking of the subsidiary characters as all having their own stuff going on. They are not merely there as an echo chamber for the main character. They will have rationales and backgrounds that are just as rich and interesting, but which we will only glimpse as readers and which won't be examined in depth. I always know more about my characters that end up going in the book. I always know more about my setting that ends up in the book. And I still find it useful, even if it doesn't feature, because it makes the world feel more solid to me, and hopefully then I can make it feel more credible to the reader as well.
Well, we haven't got much further than the prologue so far, and there is a lot more to this story. And I think maybe next we could think a little bit about the two main characters that the story starts with. One is called Kellen, and the other is called Nettle. Great names, both of them. Tell us about Kellen, first of all.
Well, Kellen has a very particular gift that would not be of relevance anywhere except Radith. Now, I'd mentioned the wilds. The strangeness of the wilds seeps into the rest of Radith, and that rather includes Radith's population. In Radith, if you are consumed by rage or hatred or pain, sometimes you develop the ability to hurl a curse at your enemy. And this curse might transform them into a different shape, or steal their shadow, or set fire to them, or make them incapable of bearing sunlight, or something like that. And usually there's no cure. 15-year-old Kellen is the only person who can lift a curse. He's also quite outspoken and impulsive and very good at annoying people in authority.
He has a lot of anger himself, really.
He does. And he's not particularly good at anger management.
Mm.
So he doesn't bottle things up in a way that might finally end up becoming a curse. It tends to sort of basically firework out of him in a way that does not necessarily always make him friends. Now, his friend Nettle is much more restrained and sometimes manages to rein him in a bit. And she's been his constant companion ever since he lifted her curse, because she spent 3 years as a heron. She and her siblings were all transformed into birds by a curse from their stepmother.
And that, to me, sounds like a cue for a reading.
There had indeed been 4 of them, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, Cole, Yannick, Iris, and Nettle. Nettle had been closest to her eldest sister, Iris. Sometimes kind, sometimes impatient, Iris had always known Nettle would follow her lead. They formed a united front in quarrels when Cole was a bossy know-it-all, or when Yannick tried to dodge his share of the chores. The mother had not been good-natured or fair as the dawn, but after her death, she had gained the sweetness of distance, like a blue and hazy hill. Now, when Nettle remembered her mother, it was as the warm heart of a peaceful time that she had only learned to cherish after it was over. It had not been so bad back then, she supposed, even though she and her family had been living within the marsh woods of the wilds. Their village was in the so-called shallow wilds, which were areas of truce. Humankind was allowed to build there, and other things could come and go if they chose. Usually they didn't. It hadn't seemed dangerous back then, just rather dull. Nettle's parents had enough money to own a real house of brick on one of the rocky outcrops, not a wooden cell house. There had been a little grove of honey pears and a blue boat tethered by the rill. There had been too many siblings, all of them larger and more argumentative than Nettle, and too little to do. No market fairs, no news, no buzzing streets, no surprises. Then it had all ended. Their mother had perished of a fever and taken their childhood with her. Another woman had married her father, and Nettle still couldn't think about her clearly. Her own anger and fear frightened her. It blinded her mind, like looking into the sun. Even though Nettle had been only 9 years old, she had started to realize that she was hated. Her stepmother hated her, hated all 4 of her stepchildren. Nettle didn't know why, nor did she ever find out. Perhaps there never was a reason, except that sometimes these things happened, particularly in the wilds. Sometimes hate was a wild thing. You might as well expect a wolf to be fair or reasonable. For 2 years, they had all lived with her stepmother's warm smiles and hatred. Nobody guessed at the curse growing inside the woman until it was far too late. One fine morning, the woman had taken all 4 children out on the boat, and in the middle of velvet green marsh lake, jewelled with dragonflies, she had released the curse inside her. It wasn't pain Nettle had felt as her bones changed inside her. She didn't think it was pain, but now that word had so many meanings in her head, she couldn't be sure. It wasn't quite death that she experienced as her mind clenched like a fist and her personality hissed out of its grip like grains of sand between tight fingers. She didn't remember seeing the other's transformation, though her dreams had painted it since. Iris sprouting dove-white down, Cole's face hardening into a hawk beak, Yannick's cries of pain becoming a gull shriek. But she knew what had happened to Iris almost as soon as they changed. Even her heron mind, cold and narrow as a flint, had remembered that. The blooded white shape in the undergrowth that fluttered and twitched as an eager hawk beak tore it apart. The 3 years that followed were endless and fleeting as a dream, a relentless perpetual now where time had no meaning. Food, flight, fear, coiled spring instincts spurred her mindlessly, puppeted her body, governed her world. The only thing that pierced her heron trance was Yannick. Sometimes she would look up and her black, watchful eyes would see another bird soaring high above, and she would know him. Some grains of herself would return to her grip. She had lost something, hadn't she? And that gull above her was... Nettle could still recall the torture of remembering all over again that she wasn't really a bird. This isn't right. This isn't real. Why can't I think? Why can't I remember? I used to be able to use my brain and now I can't. Then for a moment she would know who she was and what had happened to her. She would cling to that knowledge, but it was like trying to keep thoughts straight during a maddening fever. She was dragged away from herself, whirled around, lost, again and again. She never saw her hawk brother or thought about her dove sister, but her gull always came back to her, and every time he did, Nettle recovered a little of herself for a little time, just enough. And then, one day, she was cured.
That's so beautiful, and so much to pick up just from that one short extract there, because we certainly get a sense of the fairy tale element from that reading. And of course, there are fairy tales in which characters are turned into birds or into wild swans. And as I was reading it at the beginning of the story, that name Nettle kind of conjured up for me wild swans as well, because I think the girl in that story weaves the nettles into shirts, doesn't she, to fling on them and turn them back into humans. What's interesting is that in your novel, when a curse is lifted, things are not returned, as they are in a lot of fairy tales, to exactly the way they were before. Nettle carries with her some aspects of her bird-like self that is not forgotten forever. And in some of the other transformations, characters have bits of them missing, like a bit of a finger, because of what they were transformed into.
Absolutely. Well, this is a dark fairy tale, which does have unreliable geography and man-eating horses and supernatural spiders and all that good stuff. It's also a story about trauma and recovery. It's a story about aftermaths and rage and redemption. It's about what happens to the people who have been solved, whose curses have been lifted, who are just now supposed to be happy forever. I mean, when you're in a bad situation and the bad situation goes away, you are not immediately okay again.
But I was interested that Yannick is given that opportunity to be changed back, and he just soars up in the air and is effectively saying, I don't want to be changed back.
Yeah, absolutely. At the point where Kellen has turned up thinking, "Ha! I have found out about these 4 siblings. I shall lift the curse on these 4 siblings." He's then quite thrown by the fact that only 2 of them turn up. One of them, of course, can't, because poor Iris, the dove, is no more. But Yannick, the gull, actually makes the decision, as you say, not to fly down and accept the remedy. And his reasons are initially mysterious even to Nettle, and it's a point of painful conflict between the siblings, because in a sense they both feel that the other one's betrayed them.
It's a minor point here, but I'm always interested in authors' naming of characters. And a lot of your female characters in this book, not all of them, but a lot of them are wild flowers: the tansy, the rue, the clover, the nettle. Whereas the male characters are largely known names, not commonly used names, but they are known names. And again, that just brought to mind for me more historical connections, wildflowers, herbalism, charges of witchcraft. And again, I'm not saying that that's what you're doing, but it sort of leaves a flavour of that.
A lot of my books, even the ones set in alternative worlds, do have a historical flavour. I always have an idea of the approximate technology level, and often I will be researching a particular period to or some aspects of a particular period in order to flesh out the world. In the case of Radith, its technological level is different because the nature of the wilds and so forth affects it and inhibits it in some ways and enhances it in others. So the fact that they can't use horses in the lowlands means their pedal technology is going great. They have an awful lot of really good advanced pedal-powered vehicles, because they can't use ordinary horses in the lowlands, since the horses tend to hear the calls of their man-eating marsh horse brethren and are going to jump into the bog, which is not something you want the thing pulling your carriage to actually do. In other respects, the technology is inhibited by interference from the before-mentioned supernatural spiders, who tend to have strong opinions about what sorts of technology are allowed in Radith and which aren't. And the only way you can find out that something has not found favour with them is by using it and then getting overrun by irate spiders.
Let's talk about one more character at this point who comes into the story very early on. He is called Gaul, and he rides a marsh horse, and he has a job for these 2 young people.
Well, first of all, I should probably explain what a marsh horse is. Basically, it's a lot like a kelpie, and you will find them occasionally deep in the wilds, but you will occasionally see them in human society if someone has successfully made a pact with them. And the price for that is usually an eye. So occasionally, if a very rich person wants to have a marsh horse, this quite big status symbol, pulling their carriage, then they will generally find someone who is poor or desperate enough to sacrifice their eye, and will use that eye to buy a marsh horse. But as far as the horse is concerned, they are packed to the person who gave the eye. So that person will then be the marsh horse's coachman or rider or whatever. So this marsh horseman turns up quite mysteriously at a point where Nettle and Kellen have managed to end up in jail, and says that he can get them out of the trouble, but he will want them to be working for him and his mysterious employer. And he is very cagey about who this person is and exactly what that person's agenda is. So Kellen and Nettle have serious doubts about him, but they don't have a lot of options. It should also be mentioned that when you pact with a marsh horse, that doesn't leave you quite the same afterwards. You tend to be paler and stranger and not quite so human as you were before.
Now, he takes them to a place called the Red Hospital, and they're looking here to see whether the cursors, the people who cast these curses, could escape from this stronghold in which they're held ostensibly to keep society safe. So hospital, prison. And there is quite a lot here about crime. You know, cursing could be a metaphor for crime and punishment and restoration and restorative justice. And all of those ideas are seen through this idea of cursing and what happens to people who cast curses.
Yes. And in the case of the Red Hospital, it is designed to try and keep people safe. And the reason it's red is because it's plated with iron. About the only way you can stop a cursor cursing is by loading them down with iron, surrounding them with iron, as much iron as possible. That can stop them cursing. So the Red Hospital exists so that if somebody is identified as having cursed, they are taken to the Red Hospital because it is assumed that if they've done it once, they might well do it again. But also, if people are identified as somebody who have a curse growing inside them, but who haven't cast it yet, who haven't actually cursed anybody, they also end up in the Red Hospital. And it does leave that entire culture with rather a difficult decision to make, because these people haven't actually done the thing yet. But do you leave them running around until they do? And the way Kellen describes it is, do you leave an arrow in a bow once it's been drawn just because it hasn't hurt anyone yet, or do you take it out of the bow before that happens? So it's a rather peculiar situation for a culture to find itself in.
And this is a point of difference at this point in the story between Kellen and Nettle, who we can see from some of her internal thoughts has that a sense of empathy towards the people that she sees in there.
Absolutely. I mean, Kellen, to a large extent, accepts what is generally believed about curses, namely that once they have a curse, that casting that curse is inevitable, and that once they have cast a curse, they will almost certainly grow another one and continue cursing over and over again. Nettle is a bit more inclined to question these assumptions.
There are two organisations in this novel. One is called Salvation and the other is called Rescued. Are you able to say anything about those without giving too much away?
The Rescued is basically the collective of the people whose curses Kellen's lifted. Now, left to his own devices, Kellen would probably have lifted a curse and said, "Great, you're fixed, bye." Whereas Nettle has notions of aftercare. She is aware that basically it's actually quite a struggle getting back to normal life afterwards. So she has taken pains to stay in contact with all the people that Kellen has cured. It's sort of a support network, and also from time to time quite a useful information network for each other. Salvation is something very different, and it is something that Kellen and Nettle first hear of from Gaul, and he explains to them that there are rumours that cursors can find refuge in a secret place with this organisation, whether they're prospective cursors or people who have already cursed. They can flee and hide out there. And cursors are already going missing before they can be arrested. And it's thought that they are heading to this refuge. But it's not clear if this is actually a genuine point of safety for them or whether somebody is simply collecting them.
Interesting. One of the other things that I really appreciated in your story is that it is not heteronormative. You know, we've got a character in there who, in fact, it is Gaul, who has a husband. I mean, it's not about that. It's just part of the story. And I think maybe that's a fairly big change in fantasy writing or even, you know, young people's novels over the period that you've been writing.
Yes, I think it probably has changed. I mean, certainly when I was conceiving of Gaul, I always knew that he had a spouse who was looking for him. And in my head, it was always a husband. It just was. And it didn't seem like a big deal.
It just is. And that is exactly what it is in the story. There's so much more for us to talk about in this book, and I don't want to unravel the whole story for everybody, but I am fascinated to know a little bit more about the little brothers and these spidery creatures that are not spiders, as you say right at the beginning. Maybe tell us a little bit about them from your point of view.
Now, the little brothers, these spider-like creatures that are not spiders, they are creatures of the wilds. Now, it should be mentioned that humankind and the wilds have reached a sort of a pact. And generally speaking, the creatures from the wilds are not really supposed to wash up in the human-owned areas all that much. But the little brothers are an exception. It is accepted that they will turn up. Often they'll be hard to spot, but they do interfere. And in fact, it's the little brothers who bestow the ability to curse on people. They think they're helping. They find someone who's really upset. It's like, oh, they've clearly been wronged. This will help. And they also definitely have favourites amongst the human community. They like makers because they themselves make. They're weavers. And in fact, human weavers are their very favourites. So they tend to get involved, or if there's a dispute between weavers and everybody else, they tend to get involved on the weaver's side. They find that quite hard to resist. And that is actually how Kellen has ended up with his special abilities. Because Kellen was the son of a weaver. And at one point, during a certain dispute between weavers and their employers, a particular little brother got involved in the struggle in ways that I won't go into too many details, but it brought them into contact with Kellen, and there was an incident.
Indeed there was. And there's some great imagery with them. Again, you know how readers connect one thing with something else that they've read. And for me, it conjured up M.R. James. I don't know if you know the story of the ash tree, when all those little spidery creatures come out and they're scrabbling across, the ceiling. So spiders, but not spiders.
Yes. And I do have a lot of time for M.R. James.
So just one final question, really, Frances, and that is, what were you most pleased with this particular story?
This is the wrong time to ask me. Basically, my general trajectory when I write a book is burst of massive enthusiasm, which manages to carry me through it until I hit about 2/3 of the way through, at which point I start to hate it. And then I hate it more and more until I finally get to stop working on it. And then I enter a state of fatalism where I still think it's dreadful and that everyone will hate it, but it's not the violence of hatred that I had earlier. And then at some point after it's published, if people show signs of not coming with torches and pitchforks to destroy my house, I gradually forgive it for existing.
Wow.
So, I mean, once it's been published, if people show some signs of liking it, then I'll be able to answer that question.
Well, I'll have to ask you that again at a later date, perhaps when the next book is published. Thank you so much for talking to me today in the Reading Corner and for writing the novel as well, which I'm sure is going to lead to lots of pleasurable experiences for readers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. This episode is generously sponsored by Macmillan Children's Books. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review. If you would like to find out about other events and courses, visit justimagine.co.uk. Join us again in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.